Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about red flags. No, not the type of thing that gets thrown out at you at a ball game by the ref if you mess up, and not the type of thing that people like to love to wave in front of bulls in fictional portrayals. I want to talk about another kind of red flag, and I want to talk about in particular red flag gun laws. Now, you may not know what a red flag gun law is. Don't worry, a lot of people don't. They're essentially provisions that allow a party that is concerned that you may be a danger to contact the authorities and have your guns removed. They've also been called gun violence restraining orders or gun restraining orders. And the idea is that people, they're rightly upset about some of the shooting incidents that have happened and they want to do something. Of course, it doesn't necessarily follow that what they're doing is, you know, good or isn't going to have a downside. But these red flag gun laws sound like a great idea to so many people, and that always makes me worry. And it makes me worry because usually when everybody and their brother think it's the greatest thing since sliced cheese, there's usually a huge, ginormous, Godzilla-sized downside to the idea that somehow people just happen to miss. And when they see it, it's like, doy, why didn't I see that coming? Well, yeah, that's what's going on here. And in particular, the biggest problem with this is the propensity for false flags in your red flag system, essentially. What it relies on is a random person who may not know anything about you, may not know anything about firearms, and who may have some biases or preconceived notions that that person is going to be making an assessment about whether or not to call the cops on you. And unlike just calling 911, calling the red flag number sets in motion something that doesn't, where you really have very little due process protections. Some people get like 5 or 10 days, depending on the jurisdiction, to prove that they're not incompetent to have a weapon or that they're not a danger to themselves or others. I always wondered, how do you do that? How do you prove you're not dangerous? I mean, you could point to the fact that you don't have any history of mental health problems. You could point to the fact that you've never been involuntarily committed. You could point to the fact that you've never committed a crime, let alone a violent one. But at the end of the day, how do I prove to somebody that I couldn't just spontaneously turn into a monster tomorrow and do something awful? It's kind of hard to. It's kind of hard to. You could show that you don't have any history of that sort of behavior. You could show that, you're an upstanding citizen. But somebody could rightly point out, well, a lot of bad people were upstanding citizens until suddenly they weren't. So I guess the question becomes, if you're put on the spot and you're asked to prove that you're never going to commit a crime, how do you do that? Well, you kind of can't. And it's made even more hilarious by the fact that you've got random third-party people calling in. And I could totally see what would happen. Somebody hears a conversation out of context and they run with it. And next thing you know, there's a SWAT team showing up at some guy's house while he's sitting inside drinking a cup of coffee, blissfully unaware that they're staging a siege outside until they knock on his door, because somebody maybe heard him talking about, going to the shooting range next week, and they thought that was suspicious because they don't like guns and they think anybody who has guns is dangerous or something, which given the way the culture is in some parts of this country, I mean, I could totally see that happening. Governor Cuomo reportedly wants to give school teachers the ability to red flag people. Now, students in the public school system, if you exclude public universities and you're just talking about the public grade and high school system, the oldest the students usually are 17 or 18, right? So generally speaking, a student is not going to have a weapon in the school. And if they do, you don't need a red flag order to have that gun taken away. The police or security will take it away if they can, because the person's brought it to school, which clearly, that's not something you do if you're an innocent, law-abiding gun owner. And generally speaking, children that young aren't going to be old enough to own guns. You know, they might go to the target range with their father or their uncle or their mother, but they're probably not going to own a gun themselves legally. Okay, so you know, I don't know. I mean, how many 14 or 15 or 16 or 17-year-olds can just walk into a gun shop and legally purchase a firearm? I don't know of many who can do that. If you're over 18, you might be able to make a case for long guns, you know, maybe for 17. I don't know what the rules are in every state, but to me, it seems unlikely. All right. So if you have, and in a school setting anyway, you're not allowed to bring weapons. So if you have a child with a gun, whether he somehow legally owns that gun or not, which is in itself incredibly unlikely, just the fact that he's having it in the school is suspicious. It can get taken away from him. He can get arrested, whatever. So teachers don't need the ability to red flag. If a student's got a gun, it's a red flag in and of itself. Teachers don't need the ability to call anybody about that. What would they do, though? Well, if they wanted to take the guns away from some kid's parents, now why would you do that? Now somebody might say, well, what if the kid said he's going to go get his daddy's gun and come to school and shoot everyone? Well, okay, but then couldn't you also just arrest the kid for making a threat of criminal violence? Making threats, last time I heard, was illegal. You know, to me, this is a solution in search of a problem, and I totally understand it. It sounds great on paper until you get into the nitty-gritty of how would it work, and more importantly, how would you prevent false flags? There was a case that I heard which reminded me very much of a story by the humorist James Thurber. And actually, it was in his book here, Fables for Our Time. And there's a humorous thing he does with a goose that's described as the story is told in the fashion of a children's fairy tale, but it's to make a point about misinformation. And there's a story that he tells where a goose is described as a very proper gander, because he's always, you know, very nattily dressed. And somebody overhears it and thinks that they're saying propaganda, and that, oh, well, he must be, you know, engaged in seditious activity, and next thing you know, he's arrested and killed. And it's a silly, stupid story, but the point is that Mr. Thurber hit the nail on the head. In tense times, and I get the feeling he wrote that during the 50s, in tense times, people can jump at things and, you know, run down the hall with incomplete information, and if they set in motion events that are going to have serious consequences, it's bad news, all right? We don't need crazy people going off half-cocked thinking other people are crazy and setting in motion a SWAT team coming to some poor schmuck's house, and maybe somebody gets shot or something. That's the last thing we need. At a minimum, even if nobody gets shot, great. You've got some innocent person embroiled in the legal system. They may get charged with a crime. They may get their property confiscated, their firearms taken away. And what? Because somebody maybe overheard a snippet of a conversation that they didn't quite understand? And I've heard one report of this already happening. There was a person whose son apparently was at school here in the state of New Jersey, as it happens, which is why I heard the story. Apparently, the person's son was making some remark about school safety in the event of an emergency, and said something to the effect that the security around here is, you know, kind of stinks, and like, what would my escape route be if something went wrong? Okay, so the kid's aware, and he's paying attention to his surroundings, and he's thinking about what to do in an emergency. That's great. You should be applauding him. Instead, somebody overheard that and figured, well, he must be planning to shoot up the school then, if he's thinking about that sort of thing. Instead of, well, gee, maybe with all this crap in the news, he's actually trying to think ahead so that he doesn't get hurt if something goes down. So somebody overheard this conversation. They repeated it to their parents. The parents got paranoid, called somebody else, and long and short of it is, cops came to this dude's home, his father's home, and in the middle of the night tried to barge into the house and confiscate all his firearms because somebody overheard a conversation that had nothing to do with making threats against the school or saying they were going to shoot anybody or be a danger. They actually overheard a conversation about somebody giving fairly positive, constructive feedback about the idea of school security, and they just went with it and decided, oh, that must mean they want to shoot up the school. And next thing you know, there's cops knocking down the door on some guy's house, right? And we know in New York City, Governor Cuomo in New York wants to make it so teachers can red flag people. Now, leaving aside the fact that, like I said, students shouldn't be having guns in school anyway, so teachers don't need to be able to red flag a student to make sure students don't have guns. They just, if you see a student with a gun, you call 911. You get the cops in there. On its face, carrying a gun in a school is a suspicious act. You don't need. It is its own red flag at that point. So I don't see what the point is, unless the idea is to empower students to take the guns away, or teachers rather, to take the guns away from students' parents. And the problem with that is I could easily see that happening. I mean, I know some teachers. Well, one of my good friends is a teacher, and he's a nice guy. He's also, somebody who has a great appreciation for this country and its freedoms. However, not everybody's like that, and we do know that politically, at least, a lot of the teachers' organizations are very much to the political left, and a lot of them are supporters of strict gun control. So, you're going to give those people the power to red flag gun owners. Oh, there's absolutely no way this could go wrong, right? And then if you think about this, the teachers, at least in public schools, essentially work for the government, right? It's a government-run school. It's a public school. The police that they would be calling to send to your house to take your guns away work for the government, right? They're government employees. So if you enable the teachers or anybody who works for the state, essentially, to initiate a red flag sequence under this type of legislation, what you're essentially doing is you're allowing the government to call itself to come take your guns. Oh, there's absolutely no way that could go wrong. I mean, do these people even think? Do they even look down the road a couple steps and see well, what's going to happen? And the irony is, we know that most policemen aren't out to hurt innocent people, but there are still incidents where folks are, accidentally or inadvertently shot during confrontations with police, where there are often accusations of excessive force by police, etc. So with all of this, you're now going to create a situation where people are needlessly going to be drawn into confrontations with law enforcement for no reason. I mean, forget something going wrong in terms of a person's gun rights being violated or property rights being violated. What happens when somebody is shot to death because so-and-so saw an NRA bumper sticker on somebody's car and decided to red flag them because they hate guns, or they hate, maybe they saw somebody wearing a Trump hat and that pissed them off or whatever, or could be the other way around. Could be, somebody on the right who saw somebody with a Bernie Sanders sticker and was like, oh, I'll get them. They'll never see this coming. I don't know. The point is that the way things are in the country right now, it's very divisive. And the last thing we need is to basically give people a stick that they can beat other people over the head with, that could lead to everything from the loss of your property and constitutional rights to your life. And I guess what I'm trying to wonder is, this sounds all well and good as long as it's, to use the analogy from Mr. Thurber, somebody else's goose who's getting cooked. What happens when the cops show up at your door? What if you don't even have any guns? What if somebody just says, hey, I heard that guy has some guns, right? Well, what are they going to do? They'll do a search, find out you don't own any guns according to the government, assume that the person is correct and you do have guns, they're just illegal or, unregistered, unlicensed, whatever. And next thing you know, you got the cops kicking down your door. And you're like, hey, I don't have any guns. And they tear apart your house and they do this. And I mean, seriously, where does this end? Right? Are we back in the McCarthy era? Say what you will about, the 50s. But there's a reason that McCarthyism has become a cliche. All right? Do we want people to be asking each other Are you, or have you ever been? I mean, only instead of a communist, it's going to be a gun owner, right? And anybody who owns a firearm or goes to the shooting range or does anything, they're the new boogeyman now, right? It used to be Russian spies or something. Now, well, I guess it still is Russian spies if you follow the whole election gate nonsense. But the point is that, are we ready to drop that level of McCarthyism on our own people? Are we ready to say to somebody, hey, all you got to do to ruin somebody's life and maybe get them killed if you really don't like them is drop a dime on them. Use that red flag law, right? Are we going to start seeing PSA announcements on TV? Don't forget to red flag your neighbors. It's one thing if you're talking about genuinely criminal acts like a shooting or a bombing, to say, if you see something, say something. Yes, if I see some guy sneaking around wearing a long coat and it's like, the middle of July and it looks like he's got something bulky under there, and I happen to see a policeman, I'm probably going to be like, hey, officer, you might want to check that guy out. Because it's actually suspicious. But when we enable people to just turn you in and get the cops to come to your house, confront you, take away your property, and maybe find an excuse to arrest or shoot you based on nothing, literally nothing. You don't have to. Saying that if you see something, say something implies that there's something to actually see. The red flag laws are based on third-party hearsay. Third-party hearsay. So, you say, oh, that's a very propagander. Somebody else thinks you're saying propaganda. Next thing you know, and that was a very timely example from Mr. James Thurber, because it really hits the nail on the head with this sort of thing. Again, I think he wrote it in the 50s during the McCarthy era, but the truth is that it was never more true. In fact, maybe it's not a coincidence that there's the term red in red flag, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing you'd expect to see in an incipient tyranny. It's just not. Do we want to create that kind of a situation where people can say, oh, that arsehole stole my parking space, I'm going to red flag him. Hey, maybe I'll get lucky and I'll get shot. Seriously, you and I both know there are vindictive people like that out there. And more to the point, even if you don't have somebody who's deliberately trying to get you hurt, you could have somebody who figures it's because of ideology or something. It's in their best interest to get your guns taken away. If you have somebody who really believes guns are awful, the mere presence of a gun is bad and is a bad influence and so forth, they could very easily justify in their own mind, based on that ideology, red flagging anybody who they even think owns a gun, not because that person's a danger to themselves or others, but just because that person owns a gun. I mean, if you're say you're a teacher and you're a far leftist teacher, you're one of those, gun control supporting people, right? You want to ban all guns, you think they're awful. And you happen to know that one of your students, his dad, has a couple guns, and he and the dad go target shooting or hunting or whatever. You're going to think that that's a bad environment for the kid to be growing up in. Not because it is, but just because you hate guns, and that's the view through which you're looking at things. So what happens? You see your way in your mind, based on your ideology, to red flagging that person. And you may have no malicious intent. You may think you're doing the best thing for that child, because guns are a bad influence, and he shouldn't be growing up in a home with a sportsman for a father. Maybe. But what are you doing? You're calling the cops on an innocent family, right? And look, somebody at a Starbucks called the cops on two guys who were waiting for a business associate to show up for a lunch meeting. And every Starbucks employee in the entire country had to undergo mandatory sensitivity training. Now, I agree. It was bad that they called the cops on those people. They weren't hurting anybody. But you saw the reaction. It was almost like overkill. Frankly, I was surprised there weren't Starbucks employees whipping themselves publicly in the streets just to try and remind everybody, hey, we're actually not bad guys. They were so concerned with that people might think they would actually call the cops on an innocent person. But here, it's being suggested, essentially. They're putting in place a system whose sole purpose is to allow people who can't possibly know what's going on to set in motion events that could, again, have the SWAT team showing up at somebody's house. Why? Because gun control. And, when you start to hear stories about these things being abused, as they undoubtedly will, in places where they haven't already, the question you have to ask yourself is, when a policy like this gets abused, is it getting abused because they're actually abusing the policy? Or is the abuse of the policy the intent? Do they put a policy like this in place knowing that it's just one more thing to deter somebody from owning firearms in that jurisdiction? Because this isn't about preventing gun violence or anything like that. It's a cultural war against private firearm ownership. And, from here, that's what it looks like. And I'm going to be honest, I shoot archery. I have shot guns. I like to get back to the firing range and shoot a 1911 again sometime because it was really fun. But I don't own any guns right now. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is crap like this, okay? Fortunately, I don't have to worry about somebody saying, oh, my God, he has a bow and coming to my house. That could be an issue if I own firearms. And things like this make it very clear to me that if you live in a state like New Jersey or New York and you own firearms and you're not somebody who's maybe politically connected, like the mayor or the police chief, if you're just a regular Joe citizen and you own firearms in a state like this, you really are taking a risk because there are people who are willing to set in motion laws that could get you killed. Again, if somebody, even with the best of intentions, sends the SWAT team to an innocent person's house, at a minimum, what do you think is going to happen? Well, the guns are getting taken away. The person is getting taken into custody, at least until they sort things out. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there's probably going to be some pressure to charge the person with something so the government doesn't look like a total ass for mobilizing all those resources for nothing. So what happens? An innocent person gets thrown under the bus. Now, when this happens in a traffic stop, it's cause for civil rights protests. When it happens in your own home, apparently it's something to seek to promulgate rather than curtail. Rather than a cause for outrage, it's something to promote, apparently, which is the only thing that these red flag laws can do. I understand and I sympathize with people's desire to keep wackos from getting their hands on firearms. My problem is that laws like this, they sound really good on paper, like I said, but what they're essentially doing is they're creating a climate of McCarthyism. And when you have somebody like Cuomo who basically says, oh yeah, let's give the teachers the ability to randomly red flag parents they've never met based on, maybe 2 or 3 words that they overhear. You could argue when crap comes down the pike and somebody gets, an innocent person gets arrested or killed, you could, argue back and forth about whether it was well-intentioned or not, or whether it really was just an attempt to crack down on law-abiding citizens because they passed the laws knowing they were going to be abused. The point is, at the end of the day, it doesn't do any good to that innocent person, does it? Why should we set in motion a system that has so little checks and balances and is so pregnant with abuse? Like I said, the abuses in some cases, people are saying they're already starting to happen. And I kind of got to shake my head and say, what the hell did you expect? It sounds like a great idea. Well, you know what? Has nobody ever heard the expression, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is? Yeah. This is one of those times, okay? Lone Rider out.